Chris Barrie, thanks for your time. The Coalition says its policy is to turn back boats where it is safe to do so. Do you see that as a workable policy?
Well, it might work in a few instances, but whatever is going to happen out there, I think, commanding officers will always have regard to their obligations under international law, safety.
What are those obligations?
Well, I think there are three that I see. First of all, that whenever you come across a vessel that might be deemed to be in distress, you've got to be concerned about the seaworthiness of the craft. The craft has to be navigable, and the people on board have got to be in good condition. That's a food, water, health issue.
So if damage is done to the vessel, if it's not operable, the Navy will have to rescue them.
We've seen some spectacular instances in the last few years of how this game can be played. People may recall the explosion that occurred on one of those vessels. And of course, this is a cat and mouse situation. You've got people who are really determined to come to Australia for all sorts of quite worthy reasons, the majority anyway. And they see their attempts being frustrated by our forces. Of course, border protection itself is a classic Navy role. It's been a classic Navy role for centuries. If you think back over history, and I think of the Italians trying to keep the Albanians out, I think of the British trying to keep the Jews out of Palestine. So it's been around for a while. And let's remember the mid-1970s when the Vietnamese boat people were coming to Australia. And look at the Australians of Vietnamese origin now who are mainstays of our community. So it's a very interesting, tricky situation.
What you're saying is that there will be people desperate enough to come to Australia, always, who will be therefore desperate enough to disarm their own vessel.
It's a very interesting sort of situation. Last year I was in Sydney meeting with a whole bunch of people who came here in 2001. They were asylum seekers back then. And they wanted to tell me their story, in a sense, and I was very pleased to do so. And there were a couple of takeaways. First of all, the enormous admiration they had for members of the Australian Defence Force, who on one hand had a job to do, but on the other was able to look after them with a sense of compassion. Secondly, their success stories. I met a young man who learned to play cricket in the Villawood Detention Centre, aged 10. Not good enough to get into the test team, he tells me, but he is an ambassador for Cricket Australia. These are the sorts of stories that come out of our immigrant communities. And as I say, I reflect back on the Vietnam boat people who came to Australia. They frustrated our attempts to seal the border between here and there, of course. And I look around now and see Vietnamese in all sorts of walks of life, very responsible Australian citizens, very proud of this country. And the same story was echoed by these asylum seekers from 2001 who all said to me, yes, it was tough getting here, but this is still the most wonderful country on earth.
But the Coalition is saying that it will only do this where it's safe to do so. So presumably, if a boat is disabled in any way, the Navy therefore will be required to rescue them.
Well, in 2001 we did take some boats back towards Indonesia. They had been made safe. Engines had been repaired.
How many did that?
My memory escapes me now. I would say 10 or so.
That was successfully taken back to Indonesia.
Yes, but of course the more this game goes on, the tougher it's going to be, because most of these vessels that leave Indonesia are on one-way trips. The people aren't interested in going back to Indonesia. That's why they're coming here. They've paid a lot of money to do it. A lot of them have escaped from regimes we wouldn't want to know about. They made the point at the gathering last year. Most of us left because we had to. We couldn't go to an Australian embassy and get a visa. We knew we'd either be assassinated or taken to jail. And we were dissidents. There's no question we were leaving some pretty terrible regimes. So this was the only way out. I think that's something we need to bear in mind.
But there may be a handful of occasions, as there were in the past, where this can be done.
Yes. And of course, as Scott Morrison has said, where it's safe to do so. That's the enormous caveat. We'll have to wait and see.
It is the job of the Navy to be trained for this very sort of work, rescuing people at sea or turning back a boat. As you said earlier, it's not something new to the Navy. Isn't it a bit restrictive to say we shouldn't be putting members of the Defence Force into tasks that can endanger their lives?
Well, I have a great deal of confidence in the ability of our young men and women to do this task. That was reinforced really by meeting these folk last November. They're very good at it. Highly professional, highly skilled. In 2001, the most abiding principle was no one should lose their life in the execution of this operation. And I believe that to be so now. It shouldn't be different. But they did carry out those tasks with great skill.
But here's the bottom line. Do you think it's putting them at an unnecessary risk?
Not especially. It requires careful management. I know our leadership will be on top of the job.
So it is a workable policy?
I think it's a workable task. The policy, of course, is a matter for the government.
You don't think it's necessarily going to do the job of deterring boats?
I look around as the world population heads towards 10 billion people. I just can't see this problem disappearing. It's going to get harder. It's going to get tougher. You know, it sort of strikes me, why don't we give tourist visas to these people in Indonesia and put our own boat up there and bring them out here for a couple of $1,000 and put them on the same footing as people who fly into Kingsford Smith or Melbourne airports? Then we'd jump shift the game, wouldn't we?
And can I ask what the view within Navy at the moment is on this? Do you talk to people in Navy?
Not very many these days. They probably think I'm too old for this sort of conversation. But my sense of it is, and I think the Navy understands, the government has its policies. There's an iterative process in developing those policies. And orders would be issued by the Chief of the Defence Force. There'll be rules of engagement. And to the extent that they can, they'll carry out the tasks they've been assigned. But they will always be driven by those higher order issues of international law. What are their obligations for saving lives at sea and so on and so forth.
All right, Admiral Chris Barrie, thank you.
All right, thanks, David.